Hi everyone, I'm Maria McGacklin, and I recently happened on a video made last year in which this guy called Vaush purports to debunk Ben Shapiro, who in turn was purporting to debunk trans ideology. Confused? I certainly was, but I'm going to attempt to unpack at least some of it. I didn't know much more about Ben Shapiro than that he is an American conservative political commentator and an Orthodox Jew. I've seen a few clips of him here and there, but apart from watching his video debunking trans ideology, I've never listened to a whole talk or read anything by him. As for Vaush, the first time I heard of him was soon after I started this channel, when somebody suggested I check out his videos. They didn't recommend a specific one, so I just picked the most recent one at that time. But I didn't get very far into it because Vaush does that thing that I don't have the patience to watch, which is that he comments on a video as it's playing and he does it live. I'm fine if someone does that and then edits out the boring bits and the mistakes like Michael, aka King Critical, does, but Vaush doesn't do that. That's not intended as a criticism because obviously it works for him and his audience. He has nearly 100 times as many subscribers as I do, so fair play to him. I did try to watch the debate between him and King Critical, but I gave up on that for different reasons. Now I'm going to skip the first section of Vaush's video because he ended up conceding a point to Ben and I'm more interested in what they disagree on. So I'm starting 7 minutes into the video and looking at a section that Vaush calls Ben's leading question.
Now, in the past few years, you've heard a lot of statements that sound like we must not raise boys as boys and girls as girls because we just can't be sure that kids actually have the sex assigned to them at birth.
That's not even a question, let alone a leading question. So why does Vaush respond with this?
You're leading with the question there a little bit.
I'm not sure what Vaush means by that. Ben has simply made a statement which maybe raises questions or at least a request for clarification, like this.
What does it mean to raise a boy as a boy and raising a girl as a girl?
Fair question. Because of the way he phrased it, my guess would be that Ben thinks there are a few differences in the way boys and girls should be raised. I could be doing him an injustice, but given his conservative views and religious background, it seems a fair assumption that he means encouraging children to be a certain way and not be another way, depending on which sex they are. And it is precisely those kinds of ideas and expectations that gender critics are against. Let children be children. Let them develop their own interests and choose what they're into without grooming them into thinking this is what boys should do and this is what they shouldn't do because that's a girl's thing and vice versa.
You've heard that some people are men in women's bodies or women in men's bodies.
Yes, we've certainly heard that.
You may even have heard that if you're a straight dude and you don't want to have sex with a trans woman, meaning a biological male, this makes you gay.
I haven't heard that. I find it hard, but not impossible to believe, because they do say a lot of other balmy things, don't they? But being called gay when you're straight because you don't fancy men in woman face, I haven't heard that. What about you, Vaush?
I have never heard that in my life.
Good. Let's move on.
Now, I'd argue that if you're a straight guy, it is still straight to have sex with a trans woman.
Right. You would argue it, but you choose not to on this occasion, so until I hear the reasoning as to how a man having sex with another man, however either of them identifies, can be straight sex, I'll dismiss that as yet another daft thing the genderists might say.
Males and females reproduce with one another in the human species.
Oh God, the pseudo-scientific talk. The violin starts strumming. Males and females reproduce in the human species.
Well, they do. Why are you calling it pseudoscientific? Trying to poison the well or something?
The simple reality is that the human species is sexually dimorphic.
It's interesting that he would show lions here. Didn't Sean provide an example in a video of his of female lions growing giant manes as they assumed the social roles of the tribe that males previously had?
He makes it sound as if the lionesses grew manes as a result of taking on the male role. That's not why it happens.
5 wild lionesses grow a mane and start acting like males. This is a trans lion.
No, it's not a trans lion. For crying out loud, read the article. The lionesses have a genetic disorder which results in their having raised testosterone levels, as a result of which they are infertile and they have some typically male characteristics. In other words, they have what in humans would be called not trans, but a difference of sex development. But thanks for showing us how you roll, Mr. Cognitive Bias Extraordinaire. Ben goes on to list some basic truths, biological facts, not pseudoscientific talk as it transpires. Vaush keeps whining about how nobody disagrees with it in the first place.
The question of transgender people and their rights and roles and what we should do to, address their concerns is one of gender, not sex. But we always go in this litany about sex as though people disagree. It's ridiculous and a huge waste of time.
A huge waste of time, says the man who made an hour-long video involving much needless repetition and false anticipation. Here's an example of the latter.
I appreciate the fact that conservatives have heard this counterargument so many times in the past 10 years that they start preempting it in their videos now. What they do is they bring up the counterarguments and then they continue as though those counterarguments didn't exist. And the reason he said anomalous genetic conditions is because he's about to say that exceptions shouldn't define the rule.
So now Ben is dealing with what we now call the intersex gambit because, as a counter-argument, it's a red herring and he doesn't actually say what Vaush expected. He said this.
Now, the presence of abnormal development does not mean that sex is a spectrum.
Ben is correct. Sex isn't a spectrum and everything he says about sex is entirely accurate. But why does he simultaneously show a representation saying gender spectrum? Does he think the two words mean the exact same thing? He hasn't told us. I'll skip the bit where Ben uses the analogy of having the wrong number of toes doesn't mean toes are a spectrum. I didn't think it was great. But listen to this.
Now, in conventional speech, we might say humans have 5 toes. And in conventional speech, we may say there are males and females. But when you're talking science, Ben, you have to be a little more specific.
What on earth is he talking about? Does he think the words male and female aren't used when talking science? What word does he think biologists use when referring to the sex that produces either gamete? I've honestly no idea why he is saying this, and what's really frustrating is that he doesn't tell us. Instead, he indulges in pure ad hominem.
This is one of the problems with people like Ben Shapiro, who are laypersons to these types of arguments, trying to appeal to conventional definitions when discussing things with scientific specificity. It just doesn't work, folks.
Vaush makes it sound as if he himself isn't a layperson to this type of argument, as if he's got some special expertise. If he does, I'll wager it's not in science. In any event, it's irrelevant. On the topic of transgenderism, it's the argument and the evidence that matter, not the qualification of the person making it. And Vaush has focused on disparaging Ben and has said nothing about why the words male and female aren't specific enough. I'll spare you the bit of when Vaush whinges about the length of time, which is precisely 2 minutes out of an 11-minute video, that Ben spends explaining basic biological facts, including a bit about non-standard karyotypes and differences of sex development, DSDs. And Vaush asks what it has to do with trans people, and he called the information Ben provided irrelevant and somewhat inaccurate without explaining how. In fact, it was neither. The name of Ben's video is Debunked Transgender Ideology, and Vaush himself had just referred to the intersex gambit, frequently used by genderists in order to claim sex is a spectrum, which is codswallop. So that's what Ben was doing, Vaush. He was Debunking Genderist Codswallop. Got it now? Probably not.
What?
All reproduction is rooted in the presence of sexual dimorphism. To pretend otherwise is biologically nonsensical.
Ooh.
That's why, to end a conversation on transgenderism, just ask for a simple, non-self-referential definition of the terms man and woman.
Yep, been there, done that. If there is one thing we know for sure about those captured by gender ideology, it is that they cannot give an objective, non-circular and rational definition of the words man and woman.
Wait, but now we're talking gender. You can't... Wait, Ben,
You might be talking gender, Vaush, but Ben obviously isn't. He is using the words man and woman with the globally accepted meanings of adult human male and female. In other words, they are the colloquial terms for the two sexes in mature humans. On what authority are you saying they are genders and not sexes? And how are you defining gender anyway? We are not told in this video, at least not so far into it, and we really should be. If your understanding of the words man and woman are different from how they are commonly used outside of the Wokester bubble, you ought to be prepared to explain that every time you use them in an argument about them, and to give your alternative, coherent and useful definitions of those words, which, of course, you won't be able to do. Anyway, I assumed that Vaush had provided some definitions of gender somewhere, and at this point I searched for the word gender in the titles of Vaush's other videos, and the first one I hit on was called What is Gender Abolitionism? And that's where I found his definition of gender.
Gender refers to a set of social expectations and roles that are oriented around one's sexual presentation.
Fair dues, that is at least a definition, and I can see what he means by it. Now watch.
Here in the West, we have two genders, or at least two socially recognized genders. We have men and women.
So men and women are sets of social expectations? No, those aren't genders. If you're going to insist they are genders, then what words do you use for adult human females and males? Do you expect us to say it out in full every time? Oh, I met a really nice adult human male at a party last night. I work with a great bunch of adult human females. Cultural expectations of male and female behaviours are adequately covered by the terms masculine and feminine. And if we talk about masculine women and feminine men and masculine tastes and feminine interests, it's reasonably clear what we mean. And if it isn't, it will be easy enough to explain. Right, back to the main video.
the terms man and woman, we're referring to gender. We're talking now about linguistics.
No, we're not. We're talking about sex, and you're talking about gender. Does he even know what linguistics is?
When I say non-self-referential, I mean, you can't say, I feel like a woman, therefore I am a woman. For advocates of biology, the answer for what is woman or what is man is simple. You can look at chromosomes, SRY genes, reproductive systems, verifiable answers to the question.
Okay. So, first of all, that is a social construct. Definitions are socially constructed.
He hasn't actually offered a definition. Ben is being vague here. He said you can look at chromosomes, etc., and he followed it with there are viable answers to the question. Indeed, there are, but he hasn't actually given one. I've shown these before because it's my favourite definition from the developmental biologist Emma Hilton of the word female. All you have to do now to define the word woman is stick the words adult and human in front of it, and Fanny's your aunt.
Second of all, that's sex. Sex and gender aren't the same thing. You can't critique gender ideology if you don't acknowledge that gender exists.
Huh? Oh no, of course you can't. Just like you can't critique religion if you don't acknowledge the existence of a god. You can't critique astrology if you don't believe in horoscopes. I mean, what a dumb thing to say.
Third of all, you just listed multiple characteristics for defining a person's gender, which you just admitted have variances.
Oh, as you yourself have just pointed out, he's referring to sex, not gender. Right, I am now convinced that if Vaush cares about making strong, well-reasoned arguments that can actually persuade people who are on the fence or on the other side of this debate, he should give up the live commenting, because he is coming across as very confused and he doesn't seem to realise that he's contradicting himself. But I suppose he doesn't have to care about making good arguments. His audience are probably looking for confirmation of what they already believe, and they're too dumb to realise he's making a hash of it.
So, how does this work exactly? This is a completely... these arguments are so incongruous that they're not even wrong. There's not even a point being made here. Maybe I should let him go a little while longer and see if he builds up to a point, but, I mean, how long are we going to have to wait? Look, here's a chart from the Scientific American.
Oh no, not that ridiculous thing again. I dealt with it in the video I did called What About Intersex? I guess we're going to have to go there again. Actually, before we do, I wasn't going to show this, but I now think it's worth doing. On that other video of Vaush that I found about gender abolitionism or something, as well as his definition of gender, which I thought was coherent, if nothing else, I found Vaush saying this about sex.
I'm sorry, this is how sex actually is, okay? It is a bimodal distribution.
Sex isn't a bimodal distribution. What are you talking about? A bimodal distribution is a statistical distribution that shows values clustering around two peaks. This is what one looks like. How do you measure sex? How is it quantified? What are the units on the x-axis? And what principle governs their order? Sex is binary, dichotomous. Two categories, male and female. So what are you talking about?
Where typically speaking, people fall within a closed range of options, but there are examples of people who fall closer to the other end of the spectrum than they do within their own. So to give an example, for instance, people who are male are typically larger than people who are female. But, as we all know, there are some people who are female who are larger than individual males.
Oh, he means size, not sex. Size is not sex. Size is not a predictor for sex. Measurable characteristics of people can, of course, be plotted on a graph with the units of measurement ordered along the x-axis. And if we measure a physical characteristic that everyone has, which are most things, obviously, the reason we might see a bimodal distribution is because sex is binary. There are two sexes, two categories of people that have some variation in any such parameter. This graph showing the distribution of heights of adults in a given population does not show a bimodal distribution. It shows two overlaid distributions on the same graph. The one for men is blue, pink one for women, and each follows the classic bell curve shape of a statistical normal distribution. Note, by the way, that the graph shows that men occupy a greater range of heights than women. There are more extremely short men than there are extremely tall women, but even the shortest man is still a man. Height is not a predictor for sex. If you use the same data on height but don't separate the population into male and female, there is only one peak, shown here in grey, because the difference between the means of the heights of men and women isn't big enough to make two peaks. There does seem to be a tendency to see bimodal distributions that aren't there.
So the binary grouping of gender like this doesn't really work.
Did he just say gender? Remember he said that sex and gender are different things. Remember he claimed sex is a bimodal distribution and then started talking about size for some reason. Remember he said that Gender is a set of social expectations, so not physical characteristics. Why has he suddenly switched? This is so muddled. When you're talking science, you've got to be precise, Vaush.
And if you examine the scientific literature, you'll find that there's pretty much broad consensus on the idea of sex being a continuum, like a very complex set of characteristics that we just group together for the sake of sort of social convenience.
Oh, we're back to sex again, are we? He must have just misspoken when he said gender. And now he's making the preposterous claim that there is a consensus in the scientific literature that sex is a continuum. No, there isn't. In fact, no peer-reviewed biology paper has ever described sex as a spectrum, as a continuum, as a statistical distribution of any sort. Biology defines sex by gamete type. It's a functional difference, and when Vaush refers to the scientific literature, he must be talking about ideologically motivated blog posts and opinion pieces. Even some formerly reputable scientific journals have been known to carry them on this topic. Talking of which...
See, if you want to make the argument that sex is binary, that means there are two choices.
Yes, two, male and female.
But there aren't, are there?
What, there are more than two?
See, if we go over here to the left, we see typical biological female. From top to bottom, we talk about the changes that take place over the course of their physical development, conception, birth, puberty, and so on. And as we go from left to right, we move from more feminine to more masculine genetic traits. Typical biological female might exist over here, but if we're looking, say, over here, we have something like Turner syndrome.
For a man who scorned Ben Shapiro for using the terms male and female when talking science, apparently those terms are okay now, but I'm surprised to hear him use the phrase something like Turner syndrome, let alone suggest that someone with Turner syndrome has more masculine traits than a typical female. What? What masculine trait do you think a girl or woman with Turner syndrome has, Vaush? She has one normal X chromosome. The second X chromosome is missing or partially missing. The most common symptom is short stature, so she's at what you might call the feminine extreme of the height distribution. She's also most likely to have underdeveloped ovaries. Underdeveloped ovaries are not a masculine trait. Can you not see how stupid it is to suggest that a woman with this particular DSD is less female or more male than the typical female? Is an ear any less of an ear if you can't hear with it? I won't waste time making similar points about each of the conditions listed on that thing. As I said when I talked about this graphic before, what the designer has done is take a small number of DSDs out of, I think there are about 40, but don't quote me on that, and she's decided on pretty random criteria which ones are closer to the typical female and typical male and which are furthest away in order to make an ideological point. Nothing has been measured and there is no coherence to their order.
See, sex is a lot more complicated than people like Ben Shapiro want to make it out to be.
No, it isn't. Mechanisms of sex determination are complicated, but the two sex categories are easily defined in spite of the fact that a small minority of people who fall within each of the two categories may have complex disorders. People with DSDs are still either male or female. Sex is not only binary, but a very robust binary.
Because Ben Shapiro doesn't give a fuck about science. Ben Shapiro has an agenda that he wants to push, an ideological bias that he wants to enforce on reality. And he'll claim that he stands with science, but you'll notice scientists don't appear in conservative videos on gender and sex, do they?
I don't know if that's true, but so what anyway?
No. Political pundits do. Scientists produce graphs like this.
I hate to break it to you, Vaush. No, I don't. I'm loving this. the creator of what I might laughingly call this infographic, but would more charitably be called a pile of shite, is not a scientist, but an artist. Her expertise is in visual communication and making things look pretty, and fair dues, she's done a good job. It's very pretty, and she mendaciously makes use of a spectrum of colours, presumably to help the visualisation of this random collection of DSDs as a spectrum. It has obviously fooled a lot of people who don't have a clue what they're talking about, including, evidently, Vaush. Okay, I'm sure we've all had enough for the time being. As I said at the start, I did watch the whole of Ben Shapiro's video, which is quite short, but I haven't seen the rest of Vaush's so-called debunking of it, and I'm quite interested in seeing how bad the rest of it is, so I may do another video on it. All I can say now is that I am horrified at what I've seen of Vaush so far. His so-called debunking was replete with fallacies and ad hominems, and the worst thing was the patent falsehood that the nonsense he speaks is the scientific consensus. No wonder we see so many idiots saying things like, "You're ignoring modern science," when you've got a man with hundreds of thousands of followers spreading this ridiculous misinformation. That's all. Thanks for watching. Bye.